the wisdom of conservatism has many sources. And so there should be less of a tendency to engage in the sectarian temptation to kind of ban people from the movement if they are deviationists and so forth in one way. Deviationism is something that should be left to the Stalinists and those sorts of people. So I think that conservatives need to have that kind of broad sensibility and bear that in mind and in the way that they conduct themselves so that they can persuade and not merely berate. The sense of a common external foe in the Soviet Union, the enemy of faith and of freedom, was a crucial cement for uniting, keeping these factions from going too far in one extreme. Politics is about addition, not subtraction. So what conservatives need to do is not forget their need to persuade, to build a larger group of people approving the conservative vision of things. And that requires more than simply this kind of language of combat.
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. Our guest today is Dr. George Nash. George presents a version of conservative thinker that I almost want to say we've lost. He says we need to admit that wisdom has many sources, and we need to emphasize the need for persuasion. George is a historian, an author, past president of the Philadelphia Society. He's written several books on President Hoover, but our conversation today was focused on his book called The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. He talks about 5 distinct brands of conservatism: libertarians, traditionalists, neocons, the religious right or social conservatives, and others. And in all of this, he says that we lose a conservative sensibility, shall we say, when we start fighting with each other. I think of another guest saying that there is no purity test. Anyways, thank you so much for stopping by. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, as I do most of my conversations, but it seems like each one gets better than the last. I would love to hear what you think. I'd love to hear what you'd like to see on the show. And please like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Welcome, Dr. Nash.
Good to be with you.
Excellent. We struggled at trying to pin you down. You're so busy with your writing and speaking, and you're still, very much active in the conservative movement in America, the historical movement, your work on President Hoover, etc. So I count it a privilege to be able to pin you down here today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your reaching out. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. So our conversation, I think, will primarily be focused on this book, which I just love, and I want everybody to go out and buy it. It's called The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. And you published this originally in 1976. And again, I'm holding the 2014 copy. So it's unusual for a work of history to have such durability. And I wanted to start our conversation in the middle of the book, and then you take it wherever you want. On page 155, you talk about the birth of National Review in 1956. And you quote Russell Kirk saying that the very nature of conservatism is being re-examined, end quote. So I wonder if you could start our conversation by telling us the story of people searching to understand what the nature of conservatism even was in America, or is in America.
Yes. Well, thank you. That's a very good question. The title of my book is The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. So the chapters that preceded the segment that you just quoted are the story of the various streams of consciousness, if you will, that were coming together under the rubric of what became called conservatism in America after the Second World War. 1945 was the end of World War II. It was also the year of the passing of Franklin Roosevelt. The New Deal became a little bit more a matter of the past and not present politics. But there was a reaction on many fronts by different groups of people who were more or less independent of one another in that early period, people who were resisting what they saw as a threat from the left. It seemed like the whole world was moving to the left. In 1945, the Labour Party took over Britain, and Churchill was evicted from leadership of the British government. That was another symbolic moment. In 1944, Friedrich Hayek had written a book called The Road to Serfdom, which became enormously influential in configuring the first element that I discuss in the book, namely the classical liberals and libertarians reacting against the totalitarian state, the welfare state, and defending individual liberty, property rights, and so forth. That was one component. There was a second, more or less independent grouping at the start, eventually called traditionalists or traditional conservatives, who looked to Burke and Tocqueville and others like that for inspiration and leadership. They were very concerned about the development of a secular, rootless mass society in the 1940s and a sense of the hollowing out of the cultural foundations of society, and particularly the Judeo-Christian foundations. So their champion quickly became Russell Kirk, who wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, which he saw as a book of definition based on the Burkean influence, starting with Burke, whom he regarded as the true founder of modern conservatism. And his book, in effect, contributed greatly to the naming of this movement, of this fermenting movement of different people reacting against extreme statism, extreme leftism, socialism, communism, and so forth. The third component was a group of people who were often ex-radicals themselves, who had broken from the left in various ways, particularly from the communist left, and were very much engaged in fighting what Ronald Reagan later called the evil empire, the communist threat. So libertarians, traditionalists, and anti-communist Cold Warriors were these three components at that point, three streams of thought, three groupings that came together under a magazine that had tremendous influence in shaping and defining what conservatism came to exemplify, starting in 1955, the founding of the magazine National Review, which still exists, founded by William F. Buckley Jr. Now, Buckley was a great diplomat in a way, a very young man. He was not quite 30 when the first issue appeared. He turned 30 a few days later, a very young person to have that great responsibility. Pardon me, Buckley brought together the libertarians, traditionalists, and Cold Warriors under one roof. Well, it turned out that once they got there, they faced a challenge of defining where they agreed and disagreed with one another. And as my book describes, there were two great challenges that this nascent conservative movement, as it came to be named, faced. The first was, well, what is conservatism? And was it in the line of John Stuart Mill and classical liberalism, as some would say? Or was it in the line of Burke or Tocqueville or some other historic figure? There was a whole debate that ensued, really a quest for self-definition. And the second related challenge that they faced was, what is conservatism in America? Because at that time, people like Louis Hartz, the prominent American political scientist, and Arthur Schlesinger, a liberal historian, and others were saying that the United States is essentially a liberal country. And conservatism in America is a hothouse plant imported from Europe and not of much value or relevance to the American story. Or alternatively, people who call themselves conservatives are really radical right extremists who have no intellectual ballast and no intellectual respectability and can be safely ignored and marginalized. So the conservatives had a kind of an uphill battle at this point of defining what conservatism was or is, and the many variants within that, under that umbrella, and also the question of how do conservatives justify themselves using that term and those insights associated with the term in the American context. So that's a matter that really preoccupied many of them, including Kirk, and some people with whom he did not agree, like Frank Meyer, who was an arch libertarian and so forth, and also associated with National Review. So that, in brief, is kind of that background. And much of the early development of the movement, as I call it, was an attempt to develop satisfactory responses to these questions. And then from there, they moved on to more policy-oriented critiques and set up institutions, a counterculture, if you will, that developed over time. And the story continued.
You seem to have described an era of maturity, shall we say, maybe in the mid-60s, early 70s, where this original three groups of the conservative movement seem to have found their footing. And then we have the rise of people who are, at least in my interpretation, are depending more on Leo Strauss and the Straussians, and the neoconservative kind of flavor of things, I think came around in the later 60s. But I wonder if you could take us on that journey and obviously correct what I've said that is incorrect.
No, I think you're onto something very important there. In the 1960s and 70s, there developed a tendency on the American left of disillusionment with the extremes of the left, the failures of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, a sense that American foreign policy was adrift and was not sufficiently effective in countering Soviet expansionism. And so various people on the center left, you might say, sometimes going back far enough, youthful communists, socialists, Trotskyites, whatever, began to gravitate toward the right. And Irving Kristol captured the essence of much of this phenomenon when he said that a neoconservative is a liberal who has been mugged by reality. And these were therefore people who did not see themselves as Buckley conservatives, and they had some distance, many of them, from free market economics as opposed to New Deal, welfare, statism, and so forth. So they were often people who were far out on the left, or maybe just plain liberal Democrats. But they became disillusioned with some of the results of liberalism as they saw it unfolding. Also, the 1960s was a time of great turmoil on the campuses, and many young radicals were attacking what were really established liberal professor types. And some of those established liberal professor types, some of them reacted against that in a way that pushed them toward the conservative camp in a kind of alliance eventually. Leo Strauss was an emigre German-Jewish professor of political philosophy, I guess what I could say, to be very concise about it. A brilliant teacher, obviously, a man who had many very distinguished students who went on to quite influential careers. I think of Harry Jaffa, Alan Bloom, Walter Burns, just to name a few quick examples. Hadley Arcus, living today in his 80s, was a student of Leo Strauss. And that was a kind of a subset, if you will. And some of the Straussians were very critical of the flaccidity of liberal democracy as it tried to deal with the radical anarchic upheavals of the 1960s. And this reminded some of them of the way Germany had gone under Weimar and so forth. So a number of the refugee emigre intellectuals who were associated with Strauss, but also others who were not, who came over, Hayek being another example, were having quite an influence on American conservative intellectuals. So they brought a sort of broader European dimension of learning and experience, and brought that into the American context. So the neoconservatives then could not be disparaged by the left in the way that the left had come to look down upon Buckley and Kirk and so on. Those were rather eccentric, marginal people. But they couldn't say that about some of these neoconservatives who had been credentialed in liberal academia, you see. And when they broke, and the key magazine there was Commentary Magazine under Norman Podhoretz, the other key magazine was The Public Interest, a kind of scholarly quarterly edited by Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell. So the neoconservatives were given that title by a man on the left who thought of that was a term of opprobrium. You know, these people on the left, they're deserting us. They're neoconservatives, you know, and so on. So they were increasingly influential. And just to give a little example, Irving Kristol became a regular person to write for the Wall Street Journal editorial page column for a very influential man. And finally, just a bit later, if I may expand beyond the immediate point of your question, another grouping came into this constellation that developed partly through Buckley's leadership and then through Reagan's symbolic leadership of this whole group, a multifaceted group. The fifth component, as I see it, was what we call today social conservatives, initially called the religious right, who were not exactly an intellectual movement at the start, but they were people at the grassroots very concerned about what they saw as the hollowing out of America's Christian cultural foundations at the hands of an increasingly militant secular left. And there were many issues that were quite vital to them, but the one that became dominant, and at least in public mind, was the issue of abortion on demand. So the religious right developed, and it was something unique, I think, in American history, in that it became an interfaith coalition of Orthodox Jews, Catholics, and Protestants opposing this secularizing drift, and more than a drift, at what they saw as secularizing of the state. And there were many various reasons for that, which we might discuss. So they became a kind of fifth element of the coalition and developed their own networks, a kind of evangelical subculture, a parallel universe, as someone has called it, of periodicals. A man who just passed away the other day, James Dobson, a focus on the family, was an influential voice in that grouping. So by 1980, I believe, there were five distinct elements within a broad coalition, and they had considerable common ground, and they had to argue a bit early on, especially about what constituted their grounds of unity. And then first under Buckley and then under Reagan, this movement advanced into political life in a productive way. And I see Reagan and Buckley as having many strengths, but they were particularly important as ecumenical figures. They gave each faction or component a sense of being part of the whole, having arrived, having a seat at the table. And I think that part of Buckley's importance was that through his magazine, he managed to keep these divisions from becoming so divisive as to split up the movement entirely. And Reagan, of course, spoke to the concerns of all five, and that was part of his intellectual importance, if you will, for conservatives.
Yeah, brilliant. So I like that term, ecumenical, the ecumenicism that held the five streams or factions within conservatism together. And of course, then we get to the end or the fall of the Soviet Empire. We remove at least the overt threat of communism. I think some of the radicalism of the late 1960s, the 68ers, it seemed to be less overt into the later 1980s and the early 1990s. And so it seems like the driving motivation between some of these factions softened a bit. And so I'm wondering if one of those factions became ascendant. That's part A of my question. And with your permission, I'll ask a part B. I think neoconservatism became ascendant, but I could be wrong on that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And the part B is, do you think the neoconservatism itself, if we can even give that label to a large body of work, do you think it transformed a bit with time? I think of the young Crystal, Irving Kristol versus his son Bill, both great thinkers and thinking different thoughts and writing with a different cant or a different tilt. So part A is, do you think one faction of the five became ascendant? And part B is, did neoconservatism transform over time? And maybe those aren't two related questions, because I'm obviously assuming that neocons became ascendant, but I'm wondering if you could unpack your thoughts a bit on neoconservatism.
Yes. I'll begin by pointing out that the the sense of a common external foe in the Soviet Union, the enemy of faith and of freedom, was a crucial cement for uniting, keeping these factions from going too far in one extreme. What Frank Meyer had taught through his fusionist synthesis was that the conservatives must avoid either religious authoritarianism or libertarianism pursued to the point of anarchy or just eccentricity, and that one had to remember what each contributed in a positive way. So that anti-communist sense that there is a very serious external threat had a sobering impact, I think, on almost all of these conservatives. Now, as you, I think, rightly note, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and by 1991, the Soviet Union itself had effectively disappeared. And so one of the key sources of unity for the 70s and the 80s of these different groupings was lost. And I think one thing that happened in the wake of the fall of the Cold War was people asking the question, well, what do we believe now? What unites conservatives? Where do we go from here? And also, it allowed the appearance of what I call the sectarian temptation of each group to think that it could go off on its own and kind of not need the others so much. And the neoconservatives are very important in conferring a certain kind of prestige on the conservative movement because of their prior credentials inside academia. Also, many of them were obviously very effective cold warriors in a good sense in developing magazines and other outlets for maintaining a critique of Soviet communism and the need for a strong national defense, strong alliances, and the like. And some neoconservatives, a few, got into positions of power inside the Reagan administration, the Defense Department, for example. And that increased their prominence, you might say, on the scene. And then in the 80s, there became a certain sense in some circles on the right, who became known as paleoconservatives, that the neoconservatives were too important, they were had too much influence, and that they were not true conservatives. They were really Wilsonian liberals and interventionists abroad, and they were bringing tendencies into the spectrum that were not authentically conservative. And the key figure, a public figure, you might say, in critiquing that was Patrick Buchanan, the very noted columnist. And in 2002, Buchanan, I believe, helped to found the American Conservative magazine as a kind of voice for what became known as the paleoconservatives. And there were some battles that probably aren't necessary to go into in depth, but one involving control of the National Endowment for the Humanities. William Bennett was appointed by Reagan, and he was the candidate of the neoconservatives. And he defeated a man named Mel Bradford, who was a Southerner, a kind of agrarian conservative. I'm using labels very quickly here for time purposes. And that was a battle that left considerable bitterness among the losing side, who thought, again, that the neoconservatives were interlopers, taking over the power and the prestige and marginalizing the older conservatives. And that led to a lot of ill will, but mostly below the surface while Reagan was there, although it did burst out toward the end of the Reagan term. And then you get the Gulf War, and the neoconservatives, obviously, and most American conservatives were very supportive of that first Gulf War. But Buchanan was a critic of it, and there were others. And so there was a sense developing in some corners of the right that the neoconservatives, without being part of a larger grouping, were taking too much power themselves and were pushing toward a kind of more interventionist approach to the world, even after the Cold War. Now, that approach was accepted, this kind of strong vigilance, strong national defense, etc., as long as the Cold War persisted. But afterward, there comes this period then in which many on the right start to look for a kind of new source of unity. So you get the leave us alone conservatives, kind of neo-libertarians, shall I say. That's just as a casual term. In the 1990s, you get the national greatness conservatives. Some of the neocons of the second generation started pushing that line, and they're particularly concerned about the Middle East, Saddam Hussein in Iraq at that time, notably. And then comes along compassionate conservatism under George Bush II. That was his term, with the implication of that term being that some of the older conservatives were too edgy, they were not compassionate enough sounding, they were scaring people away. So you begin to see, and I think it's never ended really since then, there's a whole variety. You hear about constitutional conservatism, crunchy conservatism, and so on, East Coast Straussians, West Coast Straussians, so on. This sense that there's kind of a search for a new fusionism or a new broad spectrum of unity in the wake of the Cold War. And in intellectual history terms, that's part of the intellectual history of the right going forward. So I do think there might be a distinction to be made between the older neoconservatives of the Crystal generation, Crystal Senior, who are often very skeptical of government involvement in the economy because they saw the New Deal or the Great Society as having engaged in overreach and having produced results that were not compatible with the intentions. Good intentions do not necessarily mean good results. So there was a kind of skepticism on the home front about the liberal welfare state. And the younger neoconservatives, I don't think disagreed with that particularly, but I think much of their emphasis came to be on foreign policy assertiveness without the Cold War as the motivating factor. So I do see some differences. And as I indicated a moment or two ago, some on the right felt that the neoconservatives had assumed too much prominence and were not authentically conservative enough. So some of those debates which were around, but which were kind of suppressed because of the need for unity under Reagan and so on, Reagan, the great ecumenical leader, some of that sense of unity disappeared. And something else happened, which is not ideological, but very important. And that is the rise of the internet and in the 90s and social media in the 2000s, so that you no longer had effective gatekeeping. National Review was the preeminent gatekeeper for conservatives for many years. Under the internet, anyone can set up a website. There are no gates, or if there are any nominally, you simply evade them. So every person can have a blog post, you see. So that's a very great change, and what Charles Krauthammer called the hyper-democracy, I think it was, of the internet. So the universe of conservatism in terms of voices expands just enormously. When I was writing my dissertation, which became my first book that you held up earlier, there were just a few dozen people who could be thought of as really active, significant intellectual conservatives, or people accepting that label or being given that label in the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s. But you begin to have a mushrooming of countercultural institutions, think tanks. Heritage Foundation comes in the 70s. AEI becomes more prominent, American Enterprise Institute. The conservative legal foundations, state-level think tanks. It's just an amazing institutional development. But beyond that comes the internet and this sense of a much more open atmosphere, and it allows voices to arise who do not always have the same tone and sort of academic patina that one expects in the magazines, periodicals, and so forth. So those are some of the factors that I hope explain the neoconservative phenomenon, why it became controversial in some circles. And I don't know that it's ever really disappeared. The term has gone out of favor, obviously, but there are people, I think, who still have that sense of what I would call conservative internationalism. Reagan was a conservative internationalist because the challenge was multinational, international. The Soviets were propping up regimes in Africa, for example, Afghanistan, and so on, well beyond the borders of the USSR. So there was something I would call conservative internationalism, but that, of course, lost some of its raison d'etre, or so some argued, when the Cold War ended and there was no longer a threat located in Moscow. So some other tendencies then emerge, the paleoconservative tendency, as I've already mentioned, and we could go on, but I should probably...
No, this is great.
You asked a question.
No. In the pre-show, I said to you, George, I could just ask you one question and then just listen and let you lecture for an hour, and it probably would be more coherent and thoughtful than me interrupting you all the time. But I do appreciate you allowing me to interrupt. I wanted to pick up on a thread. I love your term, the sectarian temptation. I've already complimented you on the term of an ecumenical leader in Reagan. And then you also mentioned the expansion of ideas with social media. The thought popped to mind of populism. So I wonder if we could tie all of those threads together, the sectarian temptation, the populist almost feeling of social media era. And again, reaching back to your book, page 376, you say that there were 5 distinct components for a generation, anyways, within American conservatism. And then quote, the conservative intellectual movement confronted an internal challenge from an unexpected figure, the presidency of George W. Bush, end quote. So you've already mentioned Bush, and we can't talk about conservatism without mentioning Donald Trump. And so you've mentioned leaders, Reagan, Bush, now I've mentioned Trump, and yet I'm wondering if it's even fair to include them in a discussion about the conservative intellectual movement in America. So there's a difference, but also a connection between these political figures, leaders, and the ideas that are developing and maturing and changing over time. So I wonder if you could reflect on that, leadership versus ideas, and feel free to say whatever you wish about President Trump too.
Yes. When I began my book, there were obviously conservative politicians on the landscape, Robert Taft, Goldwater, and so forth. But there was not that much of a connection between the emerging conservative intellectual elite and the mainstream of Republican politicians. That did develop during the 60s and 70s. Buckley obviously, again, had much to do with that. And one of the things that is noticeable to me about the conservative intellectual movement is that it becomes attached to a vehicle, and that vehicle is the Republican Party. There were a certain number of conservative Democrats in that earlier era, but the primary vehicle for conservative expression, obviously, was the Republican Party. Now, you mentioned populism. I think of Reagan as a populist libertarian in some ways, and he believed that government should be responsive to the people. He said, we tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We are the driver. The government is the car. So there are different kinds of populism in American history. It might be useful to mention at this point. Mm-hmm. Populism, in a sense, is always with us because I think it's just a feature, a kind of a subterranean feature of mass democracy. Everybody has a vote, so you have some people who are unhappy with the way the leadership in power is governing and so on. So you have that kind of tension between sometimes somewhat disaffected regular type voters and the elites who are governing or seen to be governing. But populism in American history has often been left-wing in character. One thinks of Huey Long, maybe William Jennings Bryan, if you go back far enough, Bernie Sanders today, and a few others. And their target is big companies, big business, Wall Street, and so on. It's the private sector that they are rebelling against in this kind of left-wing populistic manner. The millionaires and billionaires, as Sanders likes to say. There is, I would argue, at least since the 1940s, a kind of conservative populism. One of its first figures was Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin in his anti-communist crusade, really attacking the liberal establishment of the time, the elites who had lost much of the Eastern Europe to Stalin and been naive about communism, etc. I think of Spiro Agnew, a rather forgotten figure, Nixon's vice president, who talked about the nattering nabobs of negativism and so forth, the elites. And Nixon himself invoked a populistic notion when he talked about the great silent majority of Americans whom he implored to stay with him in 1969 during the Vietnam War, anti-war troubles and so forth. Then I think of Reagan coming along and turning his focus on a different establishment, not big business, but big government and its associated bureaucracies and supporters in academia and so on. So you have two competing kinds of populism in more recent times, the left-wing variant going after big companies, or say they are, and then the conservative variant going after Washington, D.C. as this center of arbitrary left-wing institutionalized power. And what I think of Trumpism is a kind of hybrid of the two, at least initially, because to me the distinctiveness of the Trump phenomenon in 2016 was that he was not only attacking the liberal elites, he was also attacking the Republican Party establishment. It was a factional fight. And he also attacked the conservative intellectual establishment, which was symbolized by Buckley wasn't living then, but by National Review magazine. And I think that was part of the uniqueness of Trump. He went after all of these concurrently. And Trumpism, in my argument, would be, and I'll try to be brief about this point, Trumpism was in some ways a rebellion against about every single feature of the Buckley Reaganite conservative intellectual movement as it had developed through that period of Reagan and then persisted onward through the Bush presidencies and up to Obama and even beyond. Trump disagreed with the free marketeers on tariffs, as we now see, and on government industrial policy. And they are among his sharpest critics today, some of the libertarian economists and others. He certainly in his private life did not exemplify what evangelicals and devout Catholics thought of as the proper mode of behavior of a leader, certainly. But he did support them on a key point, which is the abortion issue, and he delivered through Supreme Court nominations and other lower judicial nominations to a kind of turning away from activist left-wing judicial advocacy, that kind of thing. But I don't think of Trump as a conservative, but he is one who made that alliance. And then, of course, his view on foreign policy, America first, harkens back rhetorically to the movement that was opposed to American intervention into World War II before Pearl Harbor. But I'm not sure Trump really thinks of it that way. I'm not sure how much he knows about that period in American history, but it was taken to be his viewpoint, and he's shown, he's talked this way, that America should be much less involved in the world. So it's not the internationalism of Reagan. And if you think of Trump and Trumpism, and I don't know that Trump has an ideology, I don't think he does, but there are those who are trying to develop one, and that's kind of where we are today, to try to synthesize somehow or whatever, or justify or reconfigure the conservative phenomenon in the wake of this rather vehement attack on the Reaganites, zombie Reaganism. I don't think Trump himself has ever used the term, at least not to my knowledge, but there are those who are somewhat at least supportive of him, who regard the Reagan period conservatism is at an end. And now one often sees in the media the statement that the movement about which I wrote effectively no longer exists. We have a replacement, and then the argument becomes, well, how much does it really derive from previous conservative thought, or how much is it new? How much is it imported from Anglo-American sources? Russell Kirk talking about Edmund Burke, all of that. And how much is it import from Central European sources, Viktor Orban or whatever, integralism in some quarters, post-liberalism, is quite a popular term right now. And national conservatism is not necessarily in opposition to Reagan, but again, the emphasis is upon nationalism in a different world context. So I see the Trumpist phenomenon, at least as he spearheaded it in 2016, as very much a rebuke of and even philosophical rejection of much that had come before, along with the critique that these people, whatever they were, the Reaganites, talked a lot, but they didn't accomplish much. So there's been an attack that way, that they were not effective, they did not fight well, they were, to borrow a term, beautiful losers, you see. So there's much more that could be said about Trump and the way that the right is in ferment right now. But some of the key underpinnings of the Reagan framework, into limited government, free market, and so on, those are no longer the terms that we hear being discussed when we talk about Trump. And if I may quote one line, which I have from my book, from Frank Meyer, this libertarian who developed or said that he discerned fusionism. In 1964, he said, just listen to this one sentence: American conservatives are united in opposition to the growth of government power, of what is known as the welfare state, and to the centralization of that power in the federal executive. And I was thinking when I come across the quotation the other day, I wonder what he would think of the current firmament and the concentration of power and so on. And I know there are defenses of that, and you can go there if you like. But what I'm trying to say here is there's such a contrast between the Reagan period, both in its tone and also in its in some of these fundamental attitudes toward government and political philosophy, and what we have now. And so there's an attempt to, I think, replace it, or if you want to be more gentle, reconfigure the right in a new era. And there are arguments to be made on both sides for that. So I will leave it at that for the moment.
That's a beautiful reflection on Trumpism, and perhaps the ideas, if we can call them that, beneath that whole movement or aspect or vein theme within conservatism. I want to talk about post-liberalism, but I'm going to hold that to the side for a second. I'd love to unpack a little bit more about what you think there. But before we leave Trump, you mentioned beautiful losers. I believe that was a Sam Francis term. Yes. And so I'm wondering, and I had Yuval Levin on just recently, and I got him very excited by asking him, I said, some people define politics as the difference between friends and enemies, a Schmittian view of the world. And when you were talking just now about Trump fighting everybody, and then this theme, you see it a lot in social media, of people saying we need to be stronger, and we're not about just having nice academic, thoughtful, intellectual discussions. We need to crush our opponents. And I'm thinking, wow, there's a Schmittian flavor out there, almost Nietzschean, the strong man, it's about will. And so some of these themes make me very nervous. I'm not attributing them to Trump, so just to be clear, but I'm just wondering if you've reflected on that. A, is this something that exists, this desire to fight? And B, it would be easy to dismiss it entirely if we were being incredibly successful by being thoughtful and disputational, having discussions, intellectual, thought, and developing policy. But if we continue to lose, is it fair for us to be surprised that some people are saying, "Well, you need to fight more"? Yeah. So I wonder if you've had any reflections on this theme of fighting and the theme of losing. Do you have any thoughts on those?
Yes. Back around 2009-10, there was a phenomenon in the United States, the Tea Party movement, and people who felt that the Obama administration was lurching to the left. That was exemplified by the Obamacare proposal and the way in which it was passed, arguably in defiance of the majority sentiment of the American people at that time, according to some polling. And this, I think, led to a kind of grassroots rebellion. The Tea Party, of course, brings up the Boston Tea Party, perhaps in our memories or historical, allusions like that. But it was also kind of a grassroots movement, and that many of them, those people, walked around with copies of the U.S. Constitution, and they saw Obama as really moving beyond the constitutional limits of limited government and so forth. And I think there was that developed into a civil war on the right between the grassroots Tea Partiers and some of the Republican establishment. And this showed up in battles over who could be nominated for senator in several states. And the Tea Partiers voted for certain people in the primaries who did not look so well and were lost out eventually. But there was, I think, an anger at the Republican Party financial big donor apparatus that it was squeezing it was not listening to those people. So that's a populist rising. And it leads to a feeling that the Republicans in power were not accomplishing much. They were mouthing the cliches of traditional conservatism and so on, but they were not producing much. I myself think that there was too much expectation on the part of the Tea Partiers about what they could accomplish as long as Obama held the White House. Because even if they could manage to get something through Congress in the way of legislation, he could veto it. So I think there was perhaps an unrealistic expectation, which led to dejection when things did not turn around so quickly. But that was a kind of a component that led to the vacuum which Trump filled, because when he came along, there were people who were already dissatisfied with what they saw as a weak Republican establishment. So that's part of it. This leads me now to something that's a matter that I find very concerning, and that is that the Reagan era language discourse, Reagan in particular, was a language of liberty. Reagan said in his farewell address, he said, "America is freedom." And he said that this is individual freedom, and individuals should choose their own destiny and not be subject to what he called the whims of the state. It seems to me that the word freedom or liberty is no longer so prominent in a lot of the polemical vocabulary of the moment. And what worries me is that the language of liberty is being replaced by the language of war. And war between friends, allies on one side, and enemies. There's a Schmittian matter. I don't think most American conservatives would know. You mentioned the name Carl Schmitt, but I keep track of this in intellectual circles. I have a little folder now of articles about him and so forth. And so on. You hear the friends, enemies distinction coming in. And I find that troubling, because it seems to me that this language of war, talking of coups and uprisings and so on, is becoming more noisy, and on both sides, and that we could be talking ourselves toward a period of major conflict. By that I mean street violence and so on. We've seen some examples of that here and there. We've seen the people on the conservative side. I think it was Senator Cruz, notably. He was in a Washington restaurant and people came up and harassed him and so forth. We're seeing people on both extremes, not a lot of them probably, but still one notices it, who are engaging in behavior that is uncouth, vulgar, certainly not what we were brought up to consider polite discourse. And we may be tumbling toward a more confrontational period yet. So I do have that concern, and I can see why there would be a frustration that more has not been done. That critique emerges. And so that leads then to a willingness, I think, to accept the Trumpian approach, even though that raises some concerns from time to time about the constitutionality of certain measures and actions, et cetera. And that, so I can understand how that frustration manifests itself. But I think myself that it's dangerous to have our politics become a matter of friends versus enemies, or a matter of fighting, of perceiving the enemies, because it seems to me that that is the language that is not appropriate to politics. And the true conservative should be striving to avoid getting to that cul-de-sac where there's only one authoritarian element on one side and one on the other. And what I think about is Weimar Germany, 1932, when there were organized gangs of communists fighting gangs of uniformed Nazis on the streets of Germany. And so the center got squeezed, and we know what happened. But I think of that as an example of what we do not want to have occur. And yet there is so much pressure now to define each side in those very stark ways, and there's so much pressure toward what's called tribalism, polarization, and so on, our team versus their team, and so. And when you think about, I think that social media promotes this because there is a reward for saying more and more outlandish things because you get more clicks, you get more notice, and so forth. So there's an incentive, therefore, to move away from, let's say, Buckleyite discourse and Reagan geniality and so on, and a tendency to be very stark in portrayal of your opponents. And this is not to say that there is no reason for some of these sentiments. Obviously, a part of what I think people on the left don't appreciate is how much some of their excesses motivated people to vote for Trump, who nevertheless really did not like Trump all that much, but they saw this as a binary choice, a very stark choice. And I think that that is not, it's almost a post-conservative in situation when you get to the point where you are rhetorically at the barricades and with the worry that there will be more political violence ensuing. So I think that we're in a very a dangerous period that way, and at least in American politics. And I sense from things that I read from time to time that there are pressures building too in Canada, certainly in Britain, and elsewhere in the Western world.
Yeah. No, it worries me also. I think when we live through a time of relative stability and peace, we take for granted peace, order, and good government. And we could argue whether or not good government exists. But anyways, my second last question, and so this is my second last question. I wanted to pick up on the themes that you mentioned. You said people, I think you said we weren't brought up that way, or people were brought up differently, and we were taught to be polite. Social media is often called rage farming. If you promote rage, you'll get lots of clicks, like you said. You mentioned Kirk earlier. You also mentioned Hearts, and Hearts insisting that, well, North America is just all a bunch of liberals, so stop even talking about conservatism. And I'm connecting, don't worry, these threads will connect, don't panic yet. There is a question in here. In chapter 6, the subtitle is The Quest for a Philosophical Order. And so the notion of ideas. And my question for you, given all that rambling preamble, is I wonder if you have turned your mind at all to the underground or the underlying ideas that distinguish liberalism as a philosophical group of ideas from conservatism. Perhaps we could call it traditionalism. Perhaps you'd give it a different label. And I'll give you two examples. I'm thinking with respect to anthropology. How do we think about humans? It seems a liberal view of the world would think of humans as more like a raw material, clay or plasticine that could be molded and educated to be whatever we want them to be. Whereas a conservative anthropology would say, well, yes, we can learn and develop intellectual virtue, right? Aristotle, or moral virtue. But there is a continuing human nature that we're going to have to deal with, right? You can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but she comes running right back. I think that was Horace. We could talk about our theories of knowledge, epistemology. We're constrained by how much we can know, and as conservatives, we value what's come before because it's a beautiful demonstration of several thousand years of trial and error. So why don't we learn from that? I'm not saying we have to worship it or slavishly follow what's happened before, but we should at least admit that we've inherited an awful lot of learning from behind us. Whereas a liberal view would, at least my understanding of a philosophical liberal view would be to say, no, the past is actually tainted in some way. There's an arc of history, and we need to look forward. And we're all Hegelians now. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are with respect to modern day conservatism, or perhaps the conservative intellectual movement, and Hartz's comment about us really being at core, we're just a bunch of liberals. There isn't even such thing as a conservative philosophy. I'm not sure Russell Kirk would have seen it that way, and I know you're a senior fellow at the Kirk, what is it called? The Russell Kirk Center. And so I imagine you've turned your mind to that. If you haven't, that's okay. I know that we're getting a little bit outside the historical nature of it, but what are your thoughts on the philosophical underpinnings of the difference between liberalism and conservatism, and whether there's any nuance to be gleaned in that distinction?
Well, I think there is, and what comes immediately to mind is Thomas Sowell's distinction between constrained and unconstrained visions. Russell Kirk spoke of conservatism as being grounded in a sense of humility. Hayek talked about the limits to knowledge, the amount of knowledge that any one person can have as a constraint on the visionary, all-governing totalitarian state. And I think that was a very helpful distinction that he made at the time. Now, he called himself an old Whig and so forth, but so we can get into lots of questions here. My view is that in some ways, America had a considerable classical liberal component very early on, but I don't think that that is the sole component of the American regime, if you will. And I think Kirk is helpful here in pointing us to what you might call the conditions prior to political activity. He said political questions are ultimately religious and moral questions. So he introduces into that kind of scheme of thought a sense that one has to be humble, prudent. That was a favorite word of his in one of his books of essays called The Politics of Prudence, and so on. All of this suggesting that this world is not meant for utopia. I'm reminded of, I think it's Mark Twain's statement that there is a little bit of human nature in all of us. And I think that's a conservative viewpoint, you see. There's always a sense that if you give someone power, Lord Acton was, I think, thought of as a liberal, but power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And hence, out of that kind of vision comes the notion of checks and balances, restraints upon power. No one, no matter how well-meaning, no matter how well credentialed in academia or whatever, should have total unconstrained power. And so that all of those, I think, are elements in what I would think as a conservative sensibility. I'm not sure I want to go too far into making sharp philosophical distinctions between liberalism and conservatism that way. But I think if you look at it in terms of almost pre-political sensibilities, outlooks toward the world, the conservative tends to be more content with the way things are, not because they're perfect, but because there is great danger in a massive disruption that might lead to something far worse. And of course, liberals traditionally have been caricatured by people on the right, I suppose, as believers in kind of utopian New Age abstractions and so forth, without having a strong sense of reality. And this issue comes to the head often quite right now over how does one deal with crime. Is it, do we defund the police? Do we what do they say, decarcerate the prisons, just let more people out? Do we do what California did, at least for a time, just basically say, if you shoplift, we won't prosecute as long as it's less than $900. I think they got rid of that. But so this kind of casual cavalier attitude, which has led to rebellion in a number of very left-wing leaning cities, at least by voting patterns, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and elsewhere. So there is a feeling that if a neoconservative is a liberal has been mugged by reality, but there's another one that follows in that a neoliberal is a liberal who's been mugged by reality, but refuses to press charges. And so there's this notion that there's caricatures each way, and conservatives are all kind of frumpy and stodgy, and if not worse, prejudiced, biased, etc. And then all liberals are somehow just dreamers and without practical grasp of the way the world really is. There's some truth, you see. Usually stereotypes like that have a grain of truth in them, but it's always the individual you have to consider when you're looking at a person, and not make fallacious generalizations. So yes, also I guess it's a good time to mention Kirk again. He argued that the necessary foundation for conservatism was Christian or religion. That you could not really have a Christian, a conservative society without some grounding that way. And I think that is true, with the understanding that not every individual who is a conservative is necessarily a doctrinal Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox Jew or whatever. So it's possible in the world that we live in that people without a religious affiliation or sensibility can nevertheless be thought of as in some way conservative. But Buckley once said that's just the way it is sometimes with some people. But he said you could not become a conservative, be called one properly, if you were hostile to religion, if you were really obnoxious about it, and so on. That was incompatible with a conservative vision of the world. And I thought that was a rather helpful distinction when I first read about it a long time ago now. Yeah. So I hope that's somewhat responsive to your question. I think there are such differences. And if I may just mention, this is not meant to be a plug, but it comes in so handily here. Russell Kirk's concise guide to conservatism, published in 1957 and republished in 2019. It's a primer. It's less than 100 pages long. Right. It's not full of evocations of Burke or lots of quotations or whatever in the Kirk style, but it is a very good primer for, say, someone in high school or maybe in college who just wants to get the basic across. And Kirk did this very well. He did this in the mid-50s partly because he was concerned about the amnesia, historical amnesia of Americans about their system, and also a sense that conservatives were laboring under this claim that they had no conservative mind. It was just prejudices and so forth, and irritable mental gestures resembling ideas. I think Lionel Trilling said. Yes. That's right. So I'm not giving you a nice 5, 6, 7 point answer to your question, but it seems to me that those are some of the distinctions that can tend to separate a conservative sensibility from a liberal or more secular sensibility.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess I would agree and say, and sensibility with some content. So you've also packed in a whole bunch of content into those comments. But I always end with this question. I want to know what's keeping you awake at night right now. And one person said, well, my newborn baby. So I'm not sure. Anyways, I don't mean that kind of thing. What sort of ideas are bothering you? What am I completely missing the boat on? Is there something that you are concerned that we should be asking about and we should be thinking about more that we're really not focusing on? And if you have nothing, that's okay too. We've really focused on your book, but is there
Yes.
something that's bothering you right now?
Well, the question would be, what is conservatism going to look like in the years ahead, during and post a Trump presidency? I called this current moment a moment of attempted reconfiguration, and there are all sorts of people engaged in different quests, you might say, for a new articulation of conservatism. You mentioned the word the post-liberals, and there are many subdivisions of them. So I think what keeps me up at night along these lines is something I mentioned earlier, this sense that if we're not careful in our discourse, we American political classes, the chattering classes, as the British call them, and so forth, can lead the country in a direction where there will be more polarization and eventually even violence. And I'm afraid we are close to that now. So what I think would answer your question a different way would be that one question that I think conservatives need to ask themselves now is, what do conservatives want? What do they think they want? What should they want? And I think that most would say in so many words that we want to be free. We want to be able to live productive, useful, shall I say, virtuous lives without undue interference by the state. We want to be left alone with the government providing minimal support, because the third thing we want to be safe from foreign and domestic threats, whether that's crime, violence, external threats of various kinds abroad. So when you think what I just said, freedom, virtue, and safety are three, I think, constant conservative aspirations. And what does that parallel? It parallels the fusionist synthesis of Meyer: freedom, virtue, safety. And it also reflects three of the major early formulations of conservative thought: the libertarians, the traditionalists, and the Cold Warriors. So my concern would be that we remember that, and that conservatives continue to have or strive for what I would call an ecumenical sensibility. And I don't mean by that some rigid formulaic statement, but a recognition that conservatism as it is developed in the United States, or what is called conservatism, which has elements of classical liberalism, at least in the American context, that these should be remembered, and that we should remember that the wisdom of conservatism has many sources. And so there should be less of a tendency to engage in the sectarian temptation to kind of ban people from the movement if they are deviationists and so forth in one way. Deviationism is something that should be left to the Stalinists and those sorts of people. And that was a term that was common in the communist period. So I think that conservatives need to have that kind of broad sensibility and bear that in mind, and in the way that they conduct themselves, so that they can persuade and not merely berate. And it's important I think it was Reagan who said, and Ed Follner, who just died recently, the founder of the Heritage Foundation, both of them said that conservatism is about addition. Politics is about addition, not subtraction. So what conservatives need to do is not forget their need to persuade, to build a larger group of people approving the conservative vision of things. And that requires more than simply this kind of language of combat and so on that seems to be so commonplace right now. So these are what I think about sometimes in the night and in the daytime too.
I bet. Clearly, very well said. Wisdom has many sources. We need to focus on persuasion, avoid the sectarian temptation, ecumenical sensibility, and a whole bunch more. Dr. Nash, George, it has been fantastic. Again, I'll have links in the show notes. The conservative intellectual movement in America since 1945. I mean, everybody needs to have this on your shelf. Also, we've mentioned some books by Russell Kirk. I'll put those in the links as well. Thank you so much for making the time. Thank you for all the work you continue to do and the service you've done in societies. You've won many awards. It's just been a real honor to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to be present, and I compliment you on what you are doing through this forum and promoting good thinking.
Thank you so much. We'll talk again soon.
Hospitality.
Okay, bye now.